Chag Sameach, everyone. It's great to be here on this Shavuot afternoon with some faces I know and some faces I do not know. I want to invite folks to go ahead and use the chat just so I have a sense of who's here. You can share where you're zooming in from. And if you have any previous experience with the Tzedek box, it is totally and completely fine if you have none whatsoever. That's part of the purpose of this session, is to introduce you to it. But I would love to get a sense of the levels of experience that are in the room. So I'll tailor my presentation accordingly. I really shouldn't use the word presentation because I really am hoping that this is interactive. I'm going to be asking you to participate a bunch, both in terms of sharing your own personal experiences and reflections, but also doing a little bit of work with the text that I'll be sharing with you. So thanks to Robert and David for sharing already. We have multiple cities represented on this Zoom already. Wonderful. Thanks everyone who's writing in. Excellent. Great to see everyone. All right, so what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to put a link in the chat. If you prefer to be looking at this sheet on your own, you now have the link, but I'm also going to be sharing my screen so you can see what we're talking about. So you don't have to worry about it if you don't want to. You can always use that link later if you want to print out the text study sheet or share it with someone else. That's totally fine and great. What I'd love to do first as we introduce the subject of the Tzedek box is that I want to get people's experiences, impressions, opinions of this little box that we have here, maybe the most recognizable, at least in the 20th century, of when we say tzedakah box, what most people think of. And what I'd love to know from you all is, what are your experiences with the tzedakah box? What do you think are its strengths as a ritual object? And where do you think it are its limitations? So I'm going to invite folks to share their hand by hitting that raised hand function in Zoom, and I'll call on people. I really encourage you to participate so that we have a lively discussion. So I'd love to know who would like to share their experiences and opinions about the tzedakah box as a ritual object. Who will start us off? So Robert, you grew up with one in Hebrew school. So Robert, I'm going to invite you to come off of mute and tell us more about what that experience was like. What was the money used for? What was your understanding about it? And what is do you continue to use the tzedakah box to this day?
Thank you and good afternoon to everybody. Chag Sameach. Yeah, so that is that's the box that was always in Hebrew school, and it was always passed around, and it just became a habit of giving, and always encouraging the home to be show gratitude by giving to others. And this was a way to actually exercise that and do it in a regular way. So if I would get an allowance, there was always some money that would always go into the box, and they're doing on Sunday school. And my experience is that it went to good deeds, or also it went to something to help out Israel, and often like that was exactly the one that we had with the map of Israel on it. But later, as I grew up, I realized there were obviously other more domestic things to do, people who were immigrants in town and the poor and so forth. So plenty of domestic things to do as well. So and today, mostly my giving is online. It's not with the tzedakah box, but I do have one that I put together and use from Central, that the paper one, that pop up, which is we use that. So I think that's enough.
That's excellent. You gave us so much right there, because you spoke about the tzedakah box as a formative tool, largely for children, often as a way to build this habit and communicate this value of giving, this Jewish value, and often in the 20th century, post-war in particular, oriented toward the state of Israel, perhaps planting trees, but it didn't have to stop there. And the notion of expanding your tzedakah box to other purposes that you might notice in your own community means that the work did its job, that it started to ritualize the notion of regularly maybe looking in your pockets and rather than spending that money on frivolous things, putting your change in that box. You also noted one limitation in the 21st century is that a lot of our giving just doesn't happen with physical money anymore. And so the tzedakah box at some level might be a little outmoded in that respect. I'm wondering if anyone else would like to share their own impressions, reflections of a tzedakah box before I get to the next part of our time together. Who else would like to share? Yeah, David, please come off of mute.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in Hebrew school and yeshiva, they would give you a tzedakah box at the beginning of the term. You would then take it home. You'd put money, change in as you did. If it filled up, you would bring it back, or at the end of the school term, you would bring it, and the money would go, I guess, to Israel or to some charity. It always changed. I don't remember, but in you're right in what you said. And nowadays I don't have coins anymore. Nobody has change. I do everything online and such, and everything electronic. So I don't have physical coins anymore. So it's done online now. So that plus I had gotten from Central Synagogue the Tzedek box where you would put in the slips of paper with your aspirations. And
yes, so we're going to get to that. So very good. So David, you're sharing about your childhood as well. And similarly, in school, this was a way to collectively gather some funds and to teach children this value. And both for the reason of it going a little bit outmoded given our lack of use of paper currency and coins, really. But also, I think there's another reason that we'll get to in a moment why, to me, the tzedakah box needed an upgrade and led me ultimately to work with a group of people to propose a new ritual object that was kind of an update based on the tzedakah box, but one step further. In order to get there, though, I want to just look at a few quick texts to ground ourselves in some history and some historical memory. So in the book of Genesis, we may recall that, of course, God selected Avram to tell him to lech lecha, to go forward, and that he was going to be a blessing and that his offspring would multiply. There isn't a lot at the beginning of that story that suggests what Abraham needs to do in order to actually deserve these blessings, other than perhaps follow God's call to actually go forward. But in Genesis 18, we get a clue about what is expected from Abraham. It's at the most amazing of times. This is when God is contemplating the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And God actually asks God's self, ought I tell Abraham what I'm about to do? Because indeed, and here we go with verse 19, I have singled him out, that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of Adonai by doing what is just and right, in order that Adonai may bring about for Avram what has been promised to him. So we get this real first mention of tzedakah umishpat in the middle of the verse. This idea that it is going to be Abraham and Abraham's children's responsibility to la'asot, to do tzedakah umishpat, to do what is just and is right. So baked into our very early story with Avram, we get this mandate to do good in the world. This tzedakah is right there. Now, it becomes even more concrete a little bit later on in Tanakh when we get to the book of 2 Kings. I believe from my research that this is the first example of what you might call a tzedakah box. So let's take a look at 2 Kings 12, verses 10 through 12. Do I have a volunteer who'd be willing to read? Deb, would you be willing to come off of mute and read about the priest Yehoiada?
Sure. And the priest Jehoiada took a chest and bored a hole in its lid. He placed it at the right side of the altar as one entered the house of God. And the priestly guards of the threshold deposited there all the money that was brought into the house of God. Whenever they saw that there was much money in the chest, the royal scribe and the high priest would come up and put the money accumulated in the house of God into bags, and they would count it. Then they would deliver the money that was weighed out to the overseers of the work who were in charge of the house of God. These in turn used to pay the carpenters and the laborers who worked on the house of God.
Great, great. So I think this is a first example of an actual physical container that was used to put the money in, and when it filled up, then it would be distributed for the purpose of improving the temple. And in fact, if you all have traveled around the world, I'll be curious to see who in the chat might, for whom this might ring a bell. But if you go to old synagogues, you might see, as part of the design, a set of slots in the wall, even kind of like mail slots with different words on them. Maybe it's for the Hebrew school or for the library or for the soup kitchen or whatever causes the synagogue cared about. Those were directly built into some synagogues. And this is, a longstanding tradition of Jews supporting the Jewish community in various ways. We know in the Talmud and beyond, there are descriptions of communal support institutions, the tamhui, the kind of the daily dole, or the kupah, the weekly distribution of resources to those in need. So this collection was a way to support those communal institutions. And as we've already said, in the 20th century, with the rise of Zionism, the desire for many Jewish institutions to contribute to Israel, to rebuild Israel, led to those blue and white boxes that became so popular for a while. So what I became interested in maybe about 10 years ago is the notion that not only has giving changed, so we're not just giving based on coins, and in fact, coins have decreased in value commensurate to the needs that exist, but also there actually are so many different ways in which people contribute to the common good. And we were really focused with this tzedakah box on giving money, which certainly is necessary in order to make change, but it is not the only way to make change. So I'm going to go back to my source sheet for just a moment and actually point out, as I'm sure is evident to all of you, is that there are many different ways to think about tzedek. Yes, donating is one of them, but certainly all of you who may be volunteering in some way, giving of your time in order to support people in need, whether it's issues of literacy or hunger or immigration, or name the issue, you may be engaged in those. And as I'm talking, I invite you in the chat actually to share any causes or tasks that you perform that you think kind of fall in this general umbrella. Also, I want to put educating as part of the category of tzedek. If you are learning about issues that are important in your community, if you're teaching others, if you're informing others, that is also a form of tzedek. Knowledge is power, and knowledge often moves people to action. So that's certainly something that ought to be considered part of tzedek. And then advocacy, actually standing up and raising your voice and lobbying, trying to make change in that respect, that is another form of tzedek. So you could argue that the box was only capturing one subsection of all the different ways that we might want to encourage people to make change. So the question then became, okay, if that's true, if it is the case that we make change through a variety of different methods or levers, then how might we capture that in a box? So David mentioned that the Tzedek box, which I ultimately developed with a bunch of lay leaders and colleagues and fellow rabbinical students several years ago, was the idea that, oh, wait, we could write down what we've done and we could put that in the box. We could write a reflection of the actions that we've taken to try to improve our world and put that in the box. And in fact, that might be a beautiful way to meld this whole tradition of tzedek and doing tzedakah with another tradition that I think is deeply underused in Jewish life today, although I think Temple Israel of Boston certainly does this work well, which is the work of musar, the work of personal character development, the idea of taking stock of your personal choices and the attributes that you're trying to cultivate in yourself and deliberately trying to improve in those areas. Some of you may have heard of the concept of cheshbon hanefesh. In fact, I'll ask you in the chat to let me know if yes or no, the phrase cheshbon hanefesh is familiar to you. It is literally an accounting of the soul. If you go to Israel and you ask for the bill, you will ask for the cheshbon, which is an accounting, an inventory of what you have eaten. And in this case, a cheshbon hanefesh is an accounting of your soul, your attributes, the actions that you've taken to try to improve the world. We're encouraged during the month of Elul, traditionally, to do this cheshbon in order to prepare for the high holidays, so that we can engage in the most serious of repentance. But you don't need to reserve cheshbon hanefesh for Elul. We should constantly be doing cheshbon hanefesh. And in fact, as you'll see on my source sheet, whom I might consider to be an early advocate of cheshbon hanefesh, Bachya Ibn Pakuda, the Sephardic scholar, shared this line: days are like scrolls. Write on them what you wish to be remembered. So there's this deep invitation to consider how we might actually write down what we do and do that in a holy and sacred way. Treat that as an act of intentionality, that if we think seriously about a book of life or about our days as scrolls, then what are we writing in that book? Let's make sure our actions reflect our values. So if we can put together this idea of tzedek with this idea of cheshbon hanefesh, well, then that makes the idea of a tzedek box with slips of paper that you put in the box even more potent. Now, in studying sources about musar and cheshbon hanefesh, I came across another source, which I want to share with you, which I found extremely powerful and very affirming of the ritual that we were starting to concoct. And you'll see this is the Ramchal, looked at the Babylonian Talmud and proposed a two-part strategy for your cheshbon hanefesh with two fun words. The first word is pishpush, and the second word is mashmesh. Now, pishpush, he's defining as looking at your actions and considering whether an action you've taken is indeed aligned with the mitzvot. Is what I am doing actually reflective of Torah? Is this part of a teaching of how to live one's life? So if I am making choices about how to live, of course, I want to use these guiding lights of the ancestors to help orient me. So yes, so I should love my neighbor as myself. Yes, so I should love the stranger. Yes, I should remove a stumbling block before the blind. Yes, I should make sure that my weights are properly balanced. Yes, I should leave the corner of my field or the equivalent of the corners of my field for others to take. So are the actions that I'm taking aligned? And then he added a second layer of cheshbon, mashmesh, which is to look at the completion of your mitzvot with extra scrutiny. He says, did I do this action in a way that requires correction in the future. So essentially saying it's not enough actually to just do the action, like that's nice that you left the corners of your field, but why did you do that? Did you do that because you wanted to look good in front of your friends? Did you do that because you were going to get a tax break? Did you do that because you thought there was going to be some reward involved? Or did you do so out of the pureness and depth of your heart and soul in a way that you knew that it was just a meaningful and important thing to do in its own right? If I wasn't doing so for pure motives and intentions, maybe I need to correct myself in the future. Now, Ramchal's analysis of how we might engage in Cheshbon HaNefesh, I think, has real connections to learning theorists of the 20th century. There was a famous scholar, Donald Schoen, who actually also recommended a two-part reflective process for all sorts of practitioners, including teachers, which involves both reflection in action, thinking in the moment about the choices that I just made and whether I need to adjust course based on the actions I just took, and then reflection on action, which is way after you've taken the action, look back at it and ask yourself a different set of questions. So here we see that there are two different ways in which we're invited to engage in Cheshbon. And so that helped inform the ritual that we ultimately constructed for the Tzedek box. So here's how it works. Thanks for bearing with me as I gave you a lot of that lead up. But for those of you who have practiced this ritual, maybe it's helpful to know some of the background about where it came from. But essentially, as mentioned, when you perform an action, whether it is volunteering or advocacy or education or donating, you take a holy private moment to jot down on a slip of paper what you did and what you noticed about what happened. Maybe you noticed that, like one of the things I enjoy doing, it's actually going to happen a little bit later today. I tutor at a center for people who have recently been released from prison and are trying to get their GEDs. So I tutor math for a class of adult students. And afterwards, I reflect on just how that lesson went and something that I might want to remember from it. Maybe there was something positive that happened, that a student realized, for example, that geometry is something you could use if you want to build a house. It's just a beautiful thing to see a light bulb go off in a student, and I might capture that in my reflection. I might also notice that perhaps something happened during the class that was problematic or upsetting or something I want to self-correct for the future. Maybe, for example, I had a negative interaction with a student, or I had a difficulty trying to get a student out of their shell, and I might note that as well. It becomes a diary entry to give yourself a bit of an opportunity to record what happened so you can come back to it later. So this was, Ramchal talked about the two-part process. This is part one. Just talking about the actions that you took, reflecting on those actions and things you might want to remember. And then once a year, we open our box, and that becomes the second part of the reflection. Once you've had distance from the actions, once you have a whole set of actions, hopefully, you can look back on them and you can reflect on what it's teaching you and what it's making you think. Maybe you're realizing, oh my goodness, I have been such a dabbler all year. I do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I give a little money to this organization, and I advocated once for this thing, and I showed up for this other thing because someone asked me to, but I really am not making a major dent in the issue that I care about. The slips of paper don't lie. It tells you what you did. So it allows you to really look hard in the mirror and say, okay, is this what is satisfactory to me? Or is there a different level to my success? Maybe you did spend all of your energy, maybe each week you worked at the super kitchen or tutored or whatever it was. And maybe to some degree, you're feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment that you were consistent in your action. But you might also realize that, I've really been focusing on direct service. In this case, I'm volunteering, which is very helpful in the moment. It's perhaps helping people who in that exact moment need some help, but it's not necessarily addressing a systemic issue. The problem is going to keep existing if something bigger doesn't change. So maybe I need to pair my direct action with something else. Maybe I also need to be doing some advocacy or connecting with organizations that do advocacy. Maybe there needs to be more prison education, not just, when people are coming out and then they have to, kind of live without an income until they educate themselves and then prove themselves to pass, the test necessary to have credentials. It'd be much better if this actually got taken care of while folks were inside. So maybe there's an organization I can financially support. Maybe there's some advocacy I can do. It starts to get you thinking about how to make change at a different level. So this is the power of reflection, both in the immediate, it might lead you to make some smaller scale adjustments, and in the bigger picture. I hope that those illustrations are useful to you. So what I want to do then is to share with you where we went with this. So it actually required then a few different next steps in order to build out this ritual into something that was, I think, pretty meaningful. The first is the object itself. Now, this was an amazing chance to actually re-envision what the box itself could look like. It's like a tzedakah box, but it's a tzedek box. It's more holistic than the tzedakah, than the money. It carries everything. And so I actually invited both everyday people to make their own boxes. I've led many workshops, and you could make your own box very easily using a shoe box or a cigar box or a jar. Whatever you have is totally beautiful. And I also asked some artists to also make boxes. So I'll just share with you a few examples of what this can look like. And I'll just share with you also the quote from the wonderful Rabbi Vanessa Ox, a professor, University of Virginia, and also at Hebrew Union College. Sorry for the scrolling. She says this: serving as spiritual agents, ritual objects produce a sense of religious identity, prompt holy and ethical actions, and forge connections between the individual and the Jewish community. So these objects matter. We really want to give people the chance to pour themselves into these objects. You can see this very homemade version. Someone is sharing that they place inside their hopes, dreams, aspirations, goals for a better world, filled with love, peace, and respect. It says shalom on it, and very simple, made with marker. This is a very, very high-minded box. So some of you may know the artist Toby Kahn, perhaps particularly relevant right now because of his very famous Omer counter. I saw it on display at a synagogue here in New York. They have one of his famous Omer counters, which kind of looks like the top of the tzedek box that you see in front of you. And you move the square that is in the appropriate position, depending on what moment in the Omer you're in. But here we have this beautiful blue box. He painted it blue, I think, in part to represent the sky and the water and the earth, to imagine our commitment to Tikkun Olam. He also uses these famous leveled blocks. In this case, I think it resembles a cityscape. And so it might evoke our responsibility to take care of the society that we're a part of. So it's both the natural world, but also the built world is represented here. And then what I think is amazing about this is that, to me, it looks like a mail slot. And in fact, when the Jewish Daily Forward wrote a piece about Toby's box, they said it was a mailbox to God. And indeed, when you think about putting your slips in this slot, it is indeed trying to send a holy message. And it is, to me, the equivalent of the sacrifice that our ancestors might have given. But in this case, we're, giving to the greater good in a different way. So that is his box, and that is actually, that was acquired by the Jewish Museum, which is pretty amazing. And then we did do a art display at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion's Bernard Heller Museum about 2 years ago. And this is just one example. This is someone who made this box, which was called A Seat at the Table. But all sorts of very, very interesting designs. I could probably spend a whole session just showing different pictures of different models to you. All right. So what I want to do now, the other thing that, of course, becomes necessary, and I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for a moment because I want to get people's ideas here, is if you're going to do this new ritual based on the tzedakah box, but renewing this to try to give it new energy, new life for a new generation, you got to figure out when are you going to open these boxes. So I would love, for people who do not know, if you already know, then you can't participate for the moment. But if you were to be given the opportunity to create a new Jewish holiday or imbue an existing Jewish holiday with the opening of the Tzedek box, when would you choose to have this ritual? I'll invite people to either share in the chat when you would have this holiday, or you can come off of mute, you can raise your hand, and I'll call on you and hear more about your response. So take a moment to think about when would you do it? I'm really, really curious what people come up with. And I'll also share with you some of the things we considered before we landed on the date that we did. Who would like to tell us? Who would like to make upon entering Elul? Robert, great. That makes a ton of sense. Upon entering Elul, we're preparing for the high holidays. We're engaged in the process of Cheshbon HaNefesh. So maybe we pick Rosh Chodesh Elul or sometime during Elul to open the box. We definitely could have chosen that, for sure, for sure. Any other opinions about when you might schedule an opening of this Tzedek box? You know, I had folks who had suggested to me, well, maybe we should do a modern holiday. It's a modern ritual. So maybe we should do something like International Human Rights Day is the day when you should open the box. Or maybe we should do it, someone said, on Flag Day. We don't really do very much on Flag Day. So maybe as a way to show our patriotism, we might open our boxes that day. Of course, that would limit it to Americans. That is a limitation, but that was another suggestion. Someone did suggest Yom Kippur itself. Yom Kippur is already a time when we're kind of taking stock of what's going on in our lives. So maybe we should just add this to Yom Kippur. Others said, I'm not sure that Yom Kippur is really the best because we already have so many things going on, not to mention the fact that everyone's starving. So are we really going to add another ritual? Are people going to realistically do this on Yom Kippur? So lots of different possibilities. And then we came across a text which gave us something to chew on. So I'm going to ask Trisha, great to see you. Trisha, I'm wondering if you would come off of mute and read for us Numbers 9, starting on verse 4. Now we're in the wilderness. This is actually very close. You know, we just started Numbers this week. So we're about to read this portion very, very soon. And this is a little moment in Torah that is easily missed. So Trisha, take it away.
Numbers 9, 4 through 12. Moses instructed the Israelites to offer the Passover sacrifice, and they offered the Passover sacrifice in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, in the wilderness of Sinai, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So the Israelites did. But there were some men who were unclean by reason of corpse and could not offer the Passover sacrifice on that day. Appearing that same day before Moses and Aaron, those men said to them, "Unclean though we are by reason of a corpse, why must we be debarred from presenting the Lord's offering at its set time with the rest of the Israelites.
All right, so let's pause for just a moment. So what we know so far, we know the practice of remembering Passover is now a thing. It involves making a sacrifice. There are a group of men who are not allowed to make the sacrifice. Why? What did Trisha read? Oh, go for it, Trisha. You can tell.
Because they're unclean because they were tending to a corpse.
Right. They were touching a corpse, which makes them impure, which makes them uneligible to make a sacrifice. They do not seem happy about this. So what happens next?
Let's see.
I think we're in verse 8.
Where am I starting?
Yeah, verse 8.
Verse 8. Okay. 7, 8. The print is kind of small. Moses said to them, "Stand by and let me hear what instructions the Lord gives about you."
Great.
And the Lord, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people, saying, when any of you or of your posterity who are defiled by a corpse or are on a long journey would offer a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, they shall offer it in the 2nd month on the 14th day of the month at twilight. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and they shall not leave any of it over until morning. They shall not break a bone of it. They shall offer it in strict accord with the laws of the Passover sacrifice.
Perfect. Thanks, Trisha. So I love several things about this. The first is that these individuals are questioning their inability to participate. I'm wondering if anyone wants to come off of mute or share in chat why you think this bothered them. Why were they so hot and bothered about this? This was a law. They had touched a dead body, and so therefore they were impure. Why was this so upsetting to them? That's one question we could ask. Nevertheless, they are upset, and they go to their superior, and they say, "Moses, this is not okay. Why should this be the case?" And Moses, what does Moses do? He calls his manager. He goes to God and says, "God, what should we do in this case?" And what does God do? God says, "Okay, we'll make a little loophole. We'll make a little exception. In this case, you can make the sacrifice a month later. A month later, you will presumably repurify yourself, and therefore it won't be a problem, and you'll be able to participate as well." So indeed, this notion of participating in the Passover sacrifice presumably was a meaningful and sacred act for them. And it really, I can understand why it wouldn't make sense to them. If they've touched a corpse, presumably, and indeed in the Talmud, it does suggest that those who were being spoken of, you'll see here in Sukkah 25, you'll notice it's saying there were certain men who were impure, they could not observe. Who were these people? The Baraita answers, they were the bearers of Joseph's coffin, according to one rabbi. So these people they weren't just willy-nilly, oops, I touched a dead body. These are people who were serving as stewards of Joseph. And so this was, they were presumably performing an honor, a mitzvah. And so it seemed incongruous that they would be then barred from doing something else. It's not like they had performed some sacrilege and were being barred. They were actually performing a mitzvah. And so if that's the case, God made sure that there was an alternative opportunity for this group of people. So my question to you all then is, why might this speak to an opportunity to open the Tzedek box? Why might this moment of a second Passover Sheni, actually being an interesting way to connect with the Tzedek box? How do those things intersect? do they intersect? Who's going to start us off? Trisha, go for it. Thank you.
Well, there was a lot of sacrifice involved in Passover, sacrificing of children of the Egyptians, sacrificing of animals, all kinds of critters being sent to plague the Egyptians. So anything that has a sacrifice attached to it has a special meaning because it brings in something else that's profound. So it makes it kind of a profound day. And it also shows that God was willing to make an exception. And he's made many exceptions in the Tanakh, if you've read it through like I have.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thanks for that. So in particular, well, certainly the idea of making a sacrifice and this being a modern sacrifice, I definitely connect that. And your point about God making an exception or God making an amendment to the law. In fact, isn't that what all lobbyists or all advocates want, is to notice some flaw in the existing legal structure and lobbying the people in power, and for those people in power to actually listen and do something about it? Oh my goodness, it's possible. In the Torah, we have this example. It's not the only example, as Trisha mentioned. I'll give one in particular. Can anyone think of another example in which Moses needs to consult with God and God makes a kind of adjustment or policy decision on the spot? Robert, I had a suspicion that you might have a offering here. Please. Let's just get you off of mute.
My apologies.
All right.
I forget all the names, but there's a situation where Moses appeals to Hashem when the daughters want to inherit property so the family name isn't lost.
Exactly. The daughters of Tzedek. Exactly right. That is another example in which we see that the law is not completely immutable, that it is possible for this law to evolve, to change, to be responsive to human input. And that indeed is such a foundation of our democratic life. So those of us whose Tzedek work involves advocacy, I think that we can get real inspiration from opening our boxes at this time when it is clear that God is modeling what it means to be open to change and that lobbying can have effects. I'll also note that Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, which really is not observed, it hasn't been observed since really temple times, because we, of course, stopped making animal sacrifices, and therefore that aspect of what it would mean to observe the holiday was no longer relevant. But it has been seen as a day of second chances. Indeed, for these Israelites, they had a second chance to make the Passover sacrifice. And indeed, for us, we can see it as a time, if we didn't have a chance to act in the ways that we wanted to act in the world in the most righteous of ways, this would be an occasion for us to do so, to remind ourselves that we have the following year to do this work as well. I personally have found it to be very meaningful to do this ritual in the spring, as opposed to in the Elul and Yom Kippur time period, because I think we're already thinking about a lot of other things that are related to our Cheshbon HaNefesh, but may have to do more with our interpersonal relationships, may have to do more with those closest to us, and we may forget about those in the broader sphere with whom we are also in relationship and ought to consider the ways in which we are indeed behaving with righteousness and justice. So this kind of separates out that part of one's reflection and gives a special pedestal to consider, how am I showing up for my community? Am I doing all the things I wish to do? It doesn't preclude you, of course, from also reflecting on that during Yom Kippur, but it does give it its own special stage, which I think is very nice. And it's very nice that it fits in the middle of the Omer, as we're reflecting on various character traits that we're hoping to improve anyway. It's nice that it happens as we're preparing for Shavuot, which of course we're celebrating right now, as we think about how we are going to spiritually and behaviorally prepare ourselves to receive Torah by living some of its precepts even in advance to anticipate them. So it becomes a really nice time of year to do that. And so for those of you who have never been involved in it in the past, we do have an annual occasion, a Yom HaTzedek. We've tried it a few different ways. This is still, an experiment that we're constantly iterating and tweaking. The first year that we did it in a very formal ceremony in the synagogue. The second year was also a formal ceremony, but involved a bit more discussion. This past year, we did it online, and it was much more like a Seder insofar as there was a lot more discussion. And I really liked that. And it seemed like those who participated also really liked really getting to hear from one another as opposed to having a lot more pomp and circumstance, which kind of suck time from people's actual ability to consider what they did and to make meaning of it. So it's a work in progress with respect to what that annual ceremony looks like, but it is certainly available to everyone to do. And I think it's nice to do it in community. It's nice to gather on a weekly or monthly basis to have the ritual of writing down what you've done and putting it in your box. And as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different ways that you can make your box. And you can decorate it in ways that are meaningful to you. Some people have put words, Hebrew words or English words that reflect the values that they hope to live out. Some people have put pictures on their boxes to reflect their loved ones, whose lives they wish to hold up as an example or for whom they want to make their own lives legacy. And we've seen people put bumper stickers about the issues that they care about to really be proud of the things that they are trying to do to make the world better. So I want to give everyone this chance right now, before we conclude, to actually take a quiet minute or two to take out a slip of paper and to take a moment to think about what is the last thing that I did to try to improve our world. And again, you have 4 different categories to choose from. And hopefully one of those categories rings a bell. Maybe you gave of your time. Maybe you volunteered in some way to make someone's life a little bit better. Maybe you made a donation to try to strengthen an institution or an organization or an individual. Maybe that's what you did. Maybe you engaged in some education. Maybe you read a book or you watched a movie or you went to a lecture to educate yourself more about an issue to help you think about it and respond in a more nuanced way. Maybe you advocated, maybe you protested, maybe you wrote a letter, maybe you made a phone call to try to make change. Take a moment to think about what you did, and on your slip of paper, write down what the circumstances were, how you felt, what stands out to you from that experience, whether or not you think you had impact. And then we're going to come back and share a little bit in just a moment. So I'm going to give people 2 minutes either to write down or, if you'd prefer, to reflect in your mind. All right, so as you all may be continuing to write, or maybe you stopped, I want to just pause and find out if anyone has any questions or comments that you want to make about this new and old Jewish ritual, which seeks to honor our Jewish value of tzedakah u'mishpat in a 21st century way. So let's see if there are any questions or comments. You can also share in the chat if you'd prefer. And as folks are thinking about that, I will share the link to the Tzedek Box website where you can learn more about the Tzedek Box. You can click the link that says stay informed if you want to join the mailing list and find out when there might be opportunities to be with us in community, either in person or virtually. And I want to thank Temple Israel of Boston so much for the opportunity to share a bit of this as we continue to celebrate Shavuot. And I wish everyone a Chag Sameach. Thank you so much, Emma.
Chag Sameach, Rabbi. Thank you. That was incredibly meaningful. We have about 8 minutes until our next session in this room starts. That's Humanize Me, Embracing Fatness and Fat Folks as a Path to Rehumanizing All the People. That's with Rabbi Mina Bromberg, and that will be starting in just about 8 minutes.
Thanks again. So long. Bye-bye.